Bodies, the Archive, and Lived Lives with Professor Madeline Mant from the Department of Anthropology at the University of Toronto at Mississauga. Bioarcheological, that is the study of human skeletons from both archaeological and historical contexts, engagement to questions of marginalization and social disenfranchisement is critical to questions of social justice in the examination of past lived lives. Learn about how marginalization may become embodied in a skeleton, the process by which individuals or skeletal collections may themselves become marginalized, and how archival sources can reveal bodies pushed to the edges of dominant narratives. We always begin with the land acknowledgement, which I'll read. We acknowledge the lands which constitute the present-day city of Mississauga as being part of the treaty and traditional territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, and Wyandot nations. We recognize these peoples and their ancestors as peoples who inhabited these lands since time immemorial. The city of Mississauga is home to many global Indigenous peoples. As a municipality, the city of Mississauga is actively working towards reconciliation by confronting our past and our present, providing space for Indigenous peoples within their territory, to recognize and uphold their treaty rights, and to support Indigenous peoples. We formally recognize the Anishinaabe origin of our name, Mississauga, and continue to make Mississauga a safe space for all Indigenous peoples. And now, some technical details. So you've seen that we've had a few technical issues. We're good now, I think. But this is a hybrid lecture. You are here in person, but we also have people attending online. And that makes things a little complicated when we get to the question period. Because I'm the moderator, if you ask a question, the people at home won't hear it. So we'll be repeating your question. Either Professor Matt or I will repeat the question so they can hear it. And when they ask questions, they'll put it in the chat, and I'll have to read it out so the professor can hear what the question is. So bear with us. That's one of the things about a hybrid lecture, but it gives everybody a chance to ask their questions. I want to plug the library. Mississauga has many library e-resources. Our 24/7 digital services are available for free with your library card, and many are also available from your home through our website, mississaugalibrary.ca. We have ebooks, magazines, newspapers, movies, music, and many specialized e-resources like Mango Languages and LinkedIn Learning. To get more information about our e-resources, go to our website or call the library. We also have newsletters, so if you want to know what's going on at the library, you can sign up for newsletters on the website. Our next lecture meeting will be on November 5th, and it will be Pseudo-Medical Psychedelia, Examining the Rhetoric of Nootropic Supplements with Professor Kate Maddalena from the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information, and Technology. This talk will describe a trend in psychotropic substances like psilocybin, ketamine, and amphetamines, all of which are touted as nootropic drugs in social media and in marketing materials. Learn about two examples of gendered framings of such substances. One is homeopathic grind culture, and the other is the mommy blogger world. Academic lectures are not dull. I'll be back for the Q&A session, but right now I'm going to pass the mic over to James Malinowski from UTM to do the introduction of tonight's lecture.
Thank you, Lucy. Good evening, everyone. In collaboration with the Mississauga Library System, we thank you for attending tonight's second Lecture Me talk of the 2024-25 season. My name is James Malinowski, and I'm the Community Engagement Officer in the Office of the Dean, Vice Principal Academic and Dean in the Experiential Education Unit at the University of Toronto, Mississauga. It is my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Madeline Mant, from the Department of Anthropology, who will be delivering her talk entitled Skeleton Keys, Bodies, the Archive, and Lived Lives. Dr. Mant is an assistant professor in the Department of Anthropology. Her biocultural research program in the Anthropology of Health focuses on health inequities in marginalized and institutionalized human groups through time. She works with human skeletons, archival medical records, and living people to explore how issues of inequality might become embodied. In her spare time, she dresses up as a medieval plague doctor, and you can follow her adventures on Instagram at Plague Doctor Time. Over to you, Professor Matt.
Thank you. Well, and thank you, James. It's so nice to meet you in person finally. We've had a lot of emails for the past couple of years. Usually I'm wearing a mask that's a little bit different. So thank you so much for the introduction. Thank you for the invitation from the Lecture Me folks. Thank you also to the wonderful folks here at the library who welcomed me so much. Thank you to everybody in attendance here and to all of those, of course, watching from home as well. So I started my academic journey as a bioarchaeologist, that is somebody who studies human remains from archaeological and historical sites. But along the way, I found that I was becoming increasingly interested in questions that demanded a more interdisciplinary focus. So I found myself increasingly involved in the archival world and the records that record these moments and the trappings of past lives. Now, skeletal collections in research institutions and historic bodies that are inscribed in primary archival documents were all once living individuals. So as researchers, we might then encounter people or encounter bodies following Chris Mounsey and some of his work in critical disability theory to think about these bodies in a variety of forms. And these encounters might take us into the field, they might take us to the lab or to the library. So my career has involved both the bones and the books, and I want to talk about both the bones and the books a little bit tonight. So tonight I'll talk about some projects I've been working on the past few years that involve encounters with bodies and then concepts of marginalization and structural violence. Now, as I get started, I just want to note that there are some images of human skeletal remains in this presentation. There's also some historical photographs that were taken in the early 20th century of folks in distress. These were taken without their consent. There is a mention of suicide, and there's a couple of instances of some offensive language in this. So just please encounter this with care and engage with it in whatever way is comfortable for you. So to start with some definitions, bioarchaeological engagement with questions of marginalization and social disenfranchisement, these big old words I threw into the description of this talk, this reveals this really multidisciplinary nature of bioarchaeological inquiry itself. But defining marginalization has proved really challenging, and scholars in social and feminist theory, in health geography, epidemiology, and nursing, medical anthropology, among others, have grappled with this topic and the relationship between marginalization and structural violence. So in some of my previous writings, I've tried too. I've been grappling as well, and I've talked about marginalization as both a process and a product, essentially boiling it down to an image like this, where there's a situation in which a group or an individual is treated differently than others or is forced into some sort of position of ambiguity. So these really slippery situations of othering represent the really powerful effects of this process, both during life and then after death, as we may seek to access information about health and disease in the past from both skeletons as well as mummified remains, as well as from archival documents. So there's a persistence of the past into the present by these remains, by these documents, and this allows us for the uncovering and amplifying of some of these narratives of vulnerable people in the past, as well as for a critical consideration of the role of the researcher in committing potential harm. So, structural violence, we need to grapple with that one as well. This is violence in which social structures or institutions perpetuate harm by preventing people from meeting their basic needs. Now, we owe this term to sociologist Johan Galtung, and that figure there on the left with all the arrows, that's coming from this paper of his. And he defined structural violence as a situation in which, quote, the power to decide over the distribution of resources is unevenly distributed. And this could end up in physical or mental harm. And this term was picked up by medical anthropologist Paul Farmer, and he applied it to clinical and public health, noting that there are inequalities that are baked right into various systems that can directly result in what he said into premature death and disability. So, colonialism, slavery, capitalism, these are all structurally violent systems in which individuals do not have equal access to resources, and the effects of this inequality can literally be embodied or written into the stories that our bodies can tell us. Now, embodiment theory, this is the last of the theoretical framing, I promise. Embodiment theory tells us that our bodies are storytellers. Our bodies can reflect aspects of the social and physical environment, and sometimes also tell stories after death that we might be unable or unwilling to express during life. And this has found its way into public consciousness, particularly in studies of trauma. Now, very excitingly, for those of us who are interested in the anthropology of health histories, the social determinants of health, as displayed here, things like your working conditions, the social location, socially ascribed race, stress, etc., these can have direct effects on our health, which might actually end up being visible in our skeletal remains or in archival traces. So I want to start by talking about the stories from the skeleton, some of the things our skeleton can tell us. Because skeletons can tell a story from the inside out. And the challenge to the researcher then is considering how the patterning of what we might see in an individual body, if these are lesions that are cancerous, traumatic, infectious, metabolic, frustratingly non-specific. Any bioarchaeologists out there in the audience will know that most things are non-specific. Both within individuals and then between bodies and various samples, these could reveal, these could emphasize, or in some cases actually draw and reframe the margins. So just as a very brief bioarchaeological introduction to the incredible range of stories that can come out of the skeleton, I want to talk about the list of things you're seeing there on the left. So the first is stress. This is a concept of huge interest in bioarchaeology as we seek to understand how patterns of acute or long-term chronic stress might actually be revealed in the skeleton. So the example I'm giving you here is our teeth. Our permanent teeth are actually really sensitive chroniclers of systemic physiological stress during childhood because our teeth are developing as we grow. And the example I'm showing you here is called linear enamel hypoplasia, literally the lines you're seeing there in the tooth enamel. So the lines in the tooth enamel, this occurs when the body is under stress. For instance, if somebody is suffering from starvation or undernutrition, maybe when they're weaning, if they're dealing with a chronic diarrheal disease, something where the body is just under some strain, the growth process actually stops, and energy is then diverted into other areas, like keeping our brain growing and operating. So when that insult stops, when food is renewed, or when the person gets over their illness, the body can then divert energy back into forming enamel again. And because we have all this great information on the regular rate of tooth enamel formation, it means we can actually estimate when these periods of stress happen in a person's childhood. And then that's there forever. That's a permanent marker of stress from childhood that you could carry with you. On the right, or on the bottom there, we're talking about congenital conditions. This is referring to something that somebody is born with. These can include genetic conditions or inherited infectious disease like congenital syphilis. Now, many congenital conditions do not have an effect on the skeleton, but some, there's various dysplasias, things like polydactyly or oligodactyly, where there's too many or too few digits, achondroplasia, microcephaly, all sorts of different things that can happen. You could have an unusual number of ribs or vertebrae, and you might not even know. This might be a secret that your body is even keeping from you. It may or may not be harmful to the person. They may or may not even know. The example I'm showing you here is an example of fixed sacrum or sacra, which are showing spina bifida. This is a pathological manifestation of a neural tube defect, which in this case you can see these people all live to be adults. So this wasn't something that actually necessarily had anything to do with the person's cause of death. It might have not been even something they knew about themselves. So a congenital condition can be silent in a lot of ways. Now, not so silent are things like dental disease. These are pretty visible, right? And so we could have dental caries or cavities, tooth losses, abscesses, periodontal disease, when your gingivitis runs amok, dental calculus, that's that tartar or plaque that the dentist insists on scraping off of your teeth every 6 months, right? Every 6 months, because all of you are going to the dentist. Okay. Get in there when you see these examples. The example you're seeing here, this is a mandible. This is your jawbone. And this person has several really serious cavities. You can see them carved out of the teeth just here. You can see there's teeth that are missing. We can see another cavity here. There's a lot going on with this individual. And so by looking at somebody's mouth like that, we can learn a little bit about their diet, maybe their dental care. With recent work with dental calculus, people have been putting that under the microscope and looking for information on the microbiome of ancient people. Really incredible work on what this means for. There was just an article that came out today talking about tobacco use. So really fascinating work that's out there looking in the mouth. We can also look at things like metabolic and endocrine diseases. So these are conditions that are like vitamin deficiencies, any type of abnormality of the endocrine glands. So if you have heard somebody talk about osteoporosis, that's a decrease in the bone mineral density. This could be age-related. There's also a genetic component. It's incredibly, incredibly complicated. Classic ones like scurvy, vitamin C deficiency. And what I'm showing you here is an example of vitamin D deficiency rickets. So this is a femur or a thigh bone. That's a normal shape. This is not normal. This is because the bone quality has actually been made poor because of a vitamin D deficiency. This person survived their rickets, but you can see they were actually able to support their weight because this person was likely walking when this happened, and literally the body weight caused that femur to start bowing out. and it doesn't pop back after they start getting enough vitamin D. So you can see, again, something written in this person's body that they might have gotten over many, many years ago. Okay, a really common one, and maybe some folks in this room are dealing with, joint disease, osteoarthritis. When you hear those joints popping and clicking, you start to wonder if maybe something like this could be going on. But a joint disease is just anything that affects the health and function of a joint. So we could have something like a complex disorder like ankylosing spondylitis. We could have autoimmune issues like rheumatoid arthritis. There might be a painful case of gout. We see that a lot with 18th and 19th century aristocrats, right? Brought on these rich diets, and we can find little gout stools in various places. But osteoarthritis, this is where the articular cartilages in those joints are breaking down over time. And mostly this manifests for folks with stiffness and pain. But if that cartilage breaks down entirely, the bone can actually start scraping against the bone. And that's what you're seeing here. These deep striations, and this is actually quite shiny when you look at it, when you look at the image really closely. This is called eburnation. There's a term for this polishing of the bone actually contacting the bone. And that lets us know, maybe hundreds of years later, looking at this person's skeleton, there's a lack of cartilage there, but also that this person was still moving, right? We have a little sense of mobility as well. On the right is an example of infectious disease. So this is another really complicated topic relating to concepts of health in the past. Now let's say a person is going about their life, and then the 1918 flu hit, and unfortunately they die. Their skeleton is not going to show us evidence they died of a flu, because they weren't sick enough for a long enough time for the skeleton to respond. But if somebody had tuberculosis or untreated syphilis for many, many, many years, these are diseases that can have skeletal manifestations, but only if a person has them for quite a long time. So on the right here is an example of somebody who lived with leprosy or Hansen's disease for a long time. And over time, somebody with Hansen's disease can develop shortening of the toes and fingers due to bony resorption. There's a lot of rumors out there about leprosy or Hansen's disease. It's not somebody's flesh rotting away and falling off. It is not like they depicted it in Ben-Hur, a movie that really annoyed me when I was a kid about this. Generally, folks are developing nerve damage, right? And so they're not feeling maybe there's an infection or a burn on a finger or a toe, and eventually that gets resorbed. This is a chronic condition that now is very treatable. The bone doesn't come back, but it can be arrested with antibiotics. So I bring all of that up also to say, as an example here, I've put neoplastic disease and trauma on the same slide, two very complicated topics, because what you're seeing in these pictures are two different holes in the head, right? The one on the left here is actually an example of an osteosarcoma, so a form of cancer that's eating through the bone. And on the right here, this individual, that's the hole in the head, that's blunt force trauma, or evidence of blunt force trauma. Now, depending upon the direction and the force and the focus, blunt force trauma could cause a depression like you're seeing there, could cause fractures and clefts. But it's really important to train and get your eye in and take a look at these conditions, because a hole in the head could be a projectile hole, like from a bullet. It could be a trephination. This could be an actual surgical intervention. Or it could be evidence of something like dissection after somebody dies. So a hole in the head is actually quite a complicated thing. And I bring all of that up because the skeleton, I hope you're already picking up, can tell us a lot about what people were dealing with during life. And we call this, the story from the skeleton, is the osteobiography, the story of an individual's life from their remains. So we can get age estimation, sex estimation, their height sometimes, maybe a sense of the pathology in their body, maybe something about the treatment after death, what they were buried with, where they were buried. So this story starts to expand. It's actually a story of somebody's life and then their remains after death. So this is not just cradle to grave. This is cradle to beyond the grave. An example I'm showing you here I really love. You're seeing there a pipe facet in the teeth. So this is somebody who's been habitually biting down. I always have like kind of Popeye in my mind when I see this, but there's a habitual behavior again and again and again, and a comfort probably in smoking. And you think, okay, there's a personality there. We're never giving humanity back to people. People are inherently humane, and maybe not inherently humane, don't quote me on that, but people are inherently human, but the behavior, you start to get little hints of it. This is not just a skeleton, right? This is the remains of a person. So taking all that together, that's what paleopathologists and bioarchaeologists are doing in the labs, is looking at a lot of these sort of signs and symbols of the skeleton and trying to put it together in these theoretical frameworks. So we've started to talk about things like identity plasticity and embodiment, thinking about age and gender and personhood, these really big topics that help us think through how and why somebody's skeleton might end up displaying certain lesions. So my really big interest in this is to extend that thinking past what lesions are present and start to think, how did this affect an individual on the day-to-day, right? How did their identity affect their access to care? Was there medical intervention? Because really, when we're looking at a skeleton, there's two things I want you to take away. The first is that a skeleton is not just a snapshot of an individual at the end of their life, right? This is the result of accumulated experience, intersecting identities, and lots of experiences all the way through their life course. And the second thing I'm borrowing from archaeologist Mike Parker-Pearson, which is that the dead do not bury themselves. So the beyond the grave part, we have to think about who's left behind, who's telling those stories and affecting those people. So a couple of examples. On the left here, we have an example, or we've heard of things like execution cemeteries. There's a lot of them in early modern England where individuals might be buried with their own head between their feet. So obviously they didn't do that themselves, right? Or maybe buried face down. The example on the left here is a so-called vampire burial from Drobsko, Poland. There are folkloric beliefs of the 17th and 18th centuries suggesting that in order to definitely keep a body in the grave, it might be best to put a sickle over their throat or a stone in their mouth, such that if somebody might happen to wake up from the dead, they would either behead themselves or be so weighed down by the stones they couldn't get back up. Very Halloween appropriate, I felt tonight. On the right there is a set of cut marks in the skeleton from Ravenna, Italy, from between the 17th and 19th centuries. This is a craniotomy. We might recognize this from medical training as part of an autopsy. So the authors, though, working on this particular individual were asking, was this an autopsy or was this anatomical dissection for research? Because there's a difference there and it matters in terms of the treatment of the person. They eventually concluded this was an autopsy, likely after an attempted surgical procedure didn't work. So maybe it was, again, the physicians looking for maybe what had happened. So again, this differentiation is important. Dissection and anatomization marks in a skeleton might indicate that the individual wasn't claimed by family to be buried. How does somebody end up being anatomized, right, or being added to a collection for teaching? So the marks of stress in somebody's bones could be key to uncovering incidents of trauma or illness or starvation in their past. Basically, you have to take the skeleton, of course, but you have to take the whole context as well. So I'm going to leave the skeletons for a moment and talk about the paper bodies. So there's an increasing interest in using archival materials and anthropological studies of bodies of the past, which could include things like the census, death records, newspaper articles, looking at biometric or anthropometric data like measurements from military enlistment papers, hospital admission records, data gleaned from gravestones, really anything you can think of that's about people. Anthropologists are there trying, the historians as well, we're neck and neck. But this really integrated work requires a consideration of biases that are inherent in these data sets. So the use of historical medical records, for instance, could give us a lot of information on how a condition progressed or just how it was understood at the time, and give us some context for better understanding what we're seeing in those skeletons. So a really great example of this are the London Bills of Mortality. So these were weekly statistical mortality statistics from London, England. They first show up in the late 16th century, and then from the early 17th until about the mid-19th century, weekly, they were recording this information. Enormous amounts of detail, and also basic epidemiological detail. These are really so exciting for people that are trying to sort of get a handle on what was going on in London at the time. Now, taking a look at this bill, I know it's a little bit tough to see, but take a look at some of those causes of death and see if you can recognize them all. There might be a few that look a little bit confusing. Some are also very specific. You might notice that burnt in his bed by a candle is just one person. So these are not necessarily common for everybody. But again, looking at something like the king's evil, that's tuberculosis. You have to know that to be able to kind of get into this. Looking at trisomes, these are infants that died before they were baptized, as though they were less than a month old. Scouring is dysentery. I guess it would feel like a scouring pad in your bowels, right? Maybe. Surfeit, this is associated with diseases, things like overeating. So 49 people are dealing with that. So Tissic is a cough, right? It seems simple to kind of get into, but you need a lot of background knowledge, and you need to make sure that you are going in with the humility that you might actually have to do quite a lot of research before you can even really get into what we're seeing. Things like dropsy, too, are words for things like edema. We have terms for this today, but we need to be able to recognize them at the time. So those labels, and I hope that you can still see a couple of examples, also people dying of things like grief. How would we talk about that in biomedicine today, right? It would be a little bit different. So to these in sort of historical and anthropological studies as a diagnostic label or a social diagnosis. We wouldn't look at this and just take it at face value. As these folks, this is, we're talking about the 17th, 18th centuries, folks were still operating under the miasma concept, meaning they believed that disease was being passed around by bad smells in the air. And I really believe we don't laugh at the past for this sort of thing. We're working under these explanatory frameworks at the time, but we have to keep them in mind. This is being relativistic. If you think that disease is being spread around by a bad smell, then your relationship to death is going to look quite a bit different than ours today. Because again, it's how disease was understood by a contemporary observer, and it might not directly align with how we understand it. So I bring that up to talk about the context in which a text is written is really critical to its use and to its analysis. There are different positionalities being met here. There's the subject, there's the author, there's the researcher. So we have to ask ourselves, who is writing these? When are they writing them? Why are they writing them? And then who has access to them? It's my lovely library archive picture here to celebrate where we are tonight. Because there has been an increased recognition in social science and humanities work that there is an inherent marginalization of certain groups, especially women and children, in the archives. Because there are biases, right, in survival, in recovery, in curation. That's really familiar to people working in archaeology. But archival bodies might also be incomplete and poorly preserved and or presented through a really violent colonial perspective. So we have to think, beyond who's being written about, whose bodies are recorded, we then need to ask ourselves which materials are ending up in the archive, which documents are being prioritized for appraisal and processing, which ones might be digitized and available to the public. Archivists are also playing a really important but a non-neutral role in this second or more life of these documents through curating purposes. And the word curation is also worth noting. It's a Latin root of cure, which means care. So we are caring for these documents. There's, of course, innate care taken in curation, but when we record, when we select, when we make available to the public, it affects who and what is cared about. And there's an incredible scholarship from folks like Anne-Laura Stoller who talks about, quote, reading against the archival grain, like looking for these people and knowing to look for them, to pick up on subtleties or silences that might be in the archive. So again, I've got two things about paper bodies I want you to take away. The first being that, unlike a skeleton, every trace of an individual in the archive is just a snapshot of a particular moment and not necessarily a cumulative record of who they are. I work primarily with medical and prison records, so every time I meet an individual in those records, it tends to be representative of somebody in crisis, in pain, institutionalized. This isn't necessarily how that person would want to be recognized or seen, or maybe not. We don't have that. We just don't have that information. The other part is the dead do not write about themselves, right? Now, the dead may have written their own diaries and letters and journals, of course, while they were alive, but once somebody passes away, there's an immediate loss of control over that narrative, and researchers need to be really cognizant of that. So, all of those warnings and that background in mind, I want to talk about a couple of case studies where I'm going to do some of this and talk you through the process. So this is a bones and books example, really distinctly. This is part of a research program, a larger question about how can we unite multiple lines of evidence to better understand the effects of institutionalization upon health. So on the left there's an image of two femora, again, your thigh bones, where the left femur has been broken into 4 pieces. So that's an example of a hip fracture right here, and I'm going to talk about hip fractures in the next little bit. So my colleagues and I have been investigating the effects of institutionalization upon individuals' health, and to do this we went to a major biological anthropological research collection called the Robert J. Terry Collection, which is curated at the Smithsonian. Now, this collection is really important for biological anthropology. The recording standards were built upon it for this whole field. And these people that are in this anatomical collection are mostly unclaimed individuals who died during the 1930s in St. Louis, Missouri. They died either in a sanitarium or in a charity hospital and were not claimed by their families post-mortem. Now, the law in Missouri at the time, and still today, is that if an individual dies in a state-funded institution, like a hospital or a prison, their family has 72 hours to claim them. So this law allowed for this amassment of this enormous anatomical collection. Many of these individuals were homeless or houseless, or maybe lived far from their family and word didn't get back to them in time. Now, what's really interesting about these people is that they're incredibly well documented. We have their age, their sex, their social race, date and cause of death, place of death, body measurements, all this sort of stuff. We have so much information about them. And I tell my students working in osteology, if you have ever put a bone in an osteometric board or plugged, a number into a algorithm to get somebody's height, like you're working with and on these people. These are the folks upon whose bodies this entire field has been based. And I'm drawing a lot of this from my colleague Helena Zelakova's work here. Now, what's important is that we do have these data. So of course we have the bones. Here's some of the books information. We have morgue records from these folks. Again, they're giving us the age, the sex, the institution. You'll notice here it says the final disposition. This person was dissected by students. So you can really start to see the interaction of all the different people post-mortem who are working with these people. Their death records have even more detail. So again, you just see so much information on the cause of death. This person had gangrene to their foot, non-diabetic. So a lot of long-term, infectious issues, et cetera. In some cases, there's even autopsy photos of these folks, which I won't be showing you today. But this is really like a 360-degree view at these people. We have their names, which means we can look them up in the newspapers. This is a level of intimacy with past people who did not give their consent to be included in this type of research that we really need to think and worry about. And the field is thinking and worrying about this right now, and I hope in a really constructive way. Now, our particular project was about hip fractures. So again, these are really high incident rates in the modern Western world. They're associated with really high morbidity, high mortality, considerable healthcare expenditure. And we were looking into the lives of individuals who died unclaimed at hospital and ended up in these collections, therefore having their final physical and social fate embodied in this way. So their skeletal analysis was fairly simple. We just said yes or no to hip fracture, present or absent, and then went and looked at that documentary evidence to see if it was listed as a primary or secondary cause of death. Was it understood at the time to be a contributing factor? And that's through those morgue and those death records. And we see that most of the folks in our sample were a little bit older, which was to be expected, and a little over a third of them were institutionalized. So we ran some very basic stats on this, and the answer was leaping out at us. It was that the institutionalized people were significantly more likely to have a hip fracture and then to ended up in this collection. And critically, so many of them here, 17 out of 40, were perimortem. Peri means around the time of death. These are people for whom it was believed the hip fracture might have been actually really related to why they had died. So, structural violence. We're seeing it enacted in these bodies really, really clearly. So these are not pictures of the individuals from Missouri. This is coming from a Life magazine expose called Bedlam 1946 from journalist Albert Maisel. He published this in Life magazine. This is an expose of institutions in Pennsylvania and Ohio. And this shocks the nation, right? It's just post-World War II. We've been seeing all these images of concentration camps that are coming up in the media, and then this is shown on American soil. This was an enormous moment for the American nation and for North America in general. Now, the Bedlam title of this article was coming from the infamous psychiatric hospital in Bromley, London, called the Bethlem Royal Hospital, which turned into calling it Bedlam. This was the first hospital for the treatment of mental illness in England, but was probably most famous for the fact that it had an 18th century policy that allowed nobles and interested members of the public to visit and view the incarcerated individuals like a human zoo. So, what we see, continuing some of that nastiness, is an underfunding of state institutions, systemic abuse, neglect, and suffering. People were being beaten by attendants. They were starved. There were pressure sores from restraints. There were corroded fire escape pieces falling off and hitting people from unsafe buildings. And maybe most damning, in the Missouri hospitals, the people we were studying in our study, we found archival evidence showing that the St. Louis State Hospital had a physician-to-patient ratio of 1 to 435. You think about the amount of time any one physician could spend with anybody, right? And we end up seeing that a lot of them are preventable deaths. So this is text coming from a lot of those death certificates. Folks were not just suffering a hip fracture because they were old, right? People were being hit, they were falling, unwitnessed falls. There was a chair in front of somebody's door. That's the one that really makes my blood run cold every time I think about it. We did ask, why is there a chair in front of somebody's door in this hospital? None of the institutionalized folks had any evidence of surgical intervention, whereas what you're seeing here is actually a screw hole in one of these broken hips. This is from a non-institutionalized person. So obviously there was an attempt for some people to do surgical intervention to try to save lives, but not for any of the people that had been in the institution. So who has access to care? Whose lives are deemed worthy of care? Super important. But again, not just historic, not just American. There are examples from the forensic literature. I'm just showing you the title of an article there. There was a 76-year-old psychiatric inpatient in Mexico whose body, after death, was unclaimed by family. She was taken to a medical school in 1996, and upon dissection, they found a hip fracture that had had surgical intervention, but the surgical plate was broken, and she had healing rib fractures. So there was potential abuse, but certainly not a lot of care going on. We see also close to home here, this is a news article just from 2017, in Oakville, Ontario, there's a nursing home resident who died with spiral fractures to both of her thigh bones. Both femora had spiral fractures. The Office of the Chief Coroner could just deem the death to be undetermined, but noted that the fractures would have been caused by a significant rotational force. So we have to ask, whose lives are deemed worthy of care in the past and today? And I want to move to thinking about this through archives again. The use of historical data sets demands consideration of ethics and consent and access and privilege in the same manner as working with bioarchaeological investigations, because these can be really revelatory of marginalization and structural violence. So a body that's showing up in a personal letter that might have been measured somewhere by an institution or counted in a national census was a living person. And I picked up on some of these people, and I want to talk to you on the last couple of examples here about institutional interplay in St. John's, Newfoundland. So for those of you who have not made it out there to the rock, to orient you, Newfoundland and Labrador is Canada's easternmost province, just here. It stretches out there into the North Atlantic, and on the right is an electoral map from 1859. You can see where there's a colorful band. Those are the electoral districts. So you can really tell where people are living on the island, right? This is the sea-facing fringe. Now, just there in red or orange, this is St. John's, Newfoundland, at the edge of the Avalon Peninsula, the most densely populated area in the province. And just up there in Labrador, this is Maine. I'm going to mention Maine in a few minutes. So just think about the distance there. That's about 700 miles away as the crow flies, but consider this journey would, of course, have been happening by boat. So the geographic isolation is really critical to think about when we're thinking about institutions. So the hospital there on the left, the St. John's General Hospital, was the only source of civilian health care on the island for nearly 100 years. Only game in town. And on the right there, we have Her Majesty's Penitentiary. This is a prison still standing and operational, though there have been 20th century additions to it. So I've been working with the records in these places, looking at hospital records from the General Hospital and records like arrest reports and the Journal of the Visiting Surgeon, who would walk over from the hospital once a week to check on the incarcerated folks, trying to build up a network analysis of people moving between institutions, including the local asylum and the poorhouse, although records for those are a little bit more scarce. Now, as a brief aside, I want to mention that the archival holdings I'm about to talk to you about, the arrest reports, et cetera, from Her Majesty's Penitentiary, these dated back to the 1830s, and they were just sitting and moldering in the basement of the prison gymnasium until about 6-7 years ago. So through the efforts of and cooperation of a retired correctional officer, through citizen archivists, through the province, the prison, and me, we got these records moved to the provincial archives for preservation, which relates, I only mention it to relate to a bias in the records. There's a great article by Chodorow who says the cultural record is essentially just what somebody put in a safe place, right? All we have to work from are things that people went, oh, this is probably important, and then tried to get it together to save. So one prong of this project I've been looking at is tracing women's health histories. And this has been involved in investigation of sex work in St. John's. Now, St. John's was and is a really critical Atlantic port city in which transactional sex became a really common form of survival for women in the 19th and early 20th centuries. So I want to highlight one particular woman here named Fanny Baker. She was a woman who was arrested 21 times in the records I've been able to look at so far for crimes like prostitution and vagrancy. But she also shows up in the hospital as an inpatient 5 times for things like venereal disease, influenza, and basically just being homeless and suffering from environmental exposure. So on the left there, I've tried to summarize a bit of this. I'll just read them for folks who might be having a bit of trouble seeing. She shows up in the hospital in 1887 for venereal disease. The next year, she's arrested, and there's a physical description. So she is 5'4", she has hazel eyes, she has black hair, and a fresh complexion. So just get an image of her. And 4 years later, she's arrested again. She's 5'4", hazel eyes, black hair, sallow complexion. Something has happened in those 4 years. You can already feel there's a change. She shows up in the hospital in 1894 for influenza. In 1895, I found 2 newspaper articles in different times of the year reporting suicide attempts from Fanny. In 1897, she goes to the hospital because she has no home. That's what the doctor wrote under basically distemper or diagnosis, was no home. 1899, she was in the hospital again because of exposure. If anybody's been to St. John's, it's cold most of the time. Sorry to anybody from Newfoundland who's watching. You know it's true. I put in my 2 years. And then in 1900, there's a death record because she dies of heart disease. So, institutional interplay, the hospital, the penitentiary, the name at the time, the Asylum for the Insane, as well as the Salvation Army mission. Fanny was failed by the social welfare system. This is not a large community. She was a known person in this community. Now, she may have been a recidivist offender arrested for sex work, but when you summarize the story like that, it's really clear this is just somebody trying to survive, right? You see there's a newspaper article from 1897, and I'll read this to you. It says, "Fanny Baker again." That's the headline. "The poor creature, according to her own story, had not eaten a morsel of food since her liberation from the penitentiary Saturday. She was in an awful state from hunger and exposure to the chill air of Sunday night, her face, which was badly swollen, being purpled from cold, while so weak was she that she had to be carried to Linneger's house, where warm drinks were given her, though she couldn't eat." The newspapers write about her all the time. They mock her issues with alcohol. In 1896, the Evening Telegram newspaper notes, quote, "She spends so much time in the penitentiary that she now considers it her home." Ugh, again, it makes me furious. It's just so nasty to begin with, but particularly so when you look at those arrest records. She's 5'4", hazel eyes, black hair, and she can read and write. It's noted every time. Fanny can read what's being written about her, and that really should give us some pause. And the final example I want to talk about just briefly, and then I will wrap up with a couple of bits of theory again, is looking at institutionalized folks within the context of colonialism. Now, the lands now known as Newfoundland and Labrador have been explored by Indigenous individuals since at least 8,000 or 9,000 years ago, but permanent colonial settlements are relatively recent. Newfoundland was predominantly a seasonal migratory fishing station until settlements started to increase in the 18th century. There were British and French immigrants, French and British immigrants who were accompanied by religious missionaries. So within that context, we have an individual named Ephraim Taxos, who is an Inuit individual from Nain, Labrador. So in 1880, he is convicted of murdering his brother-in-law, and he was sentenced to death. But the Newfoundland colonial government was nervous as to whether or not their jurisdiction or reach allowed for executions of individuals from the Moravian missions of Labrador, which really speaks to the complex relationship that Canada has had and continues to have with the original Indigenous caretakers of the land. So the Newfoundland government said, okay, we're nervous about execution, how about just life in prison? So he was taken to the penitentiary. He spent nearly 5 years there, during which time he suffers from many ailments. So he starts to show up in those physician and surgeons' reports. Really importantly, at first he seemed to have bronchitis, but it's really clearly tuberculosis. And by 1833, we start to see him on the decline. So either he contracts tuberculosis in the prison, or he'd been exposed to it earlier, and the really dire conditions there allowed it to flourish by compromising his immune system. Now let's practice our paleography. People have been able to read this. I see some squinting of the audience. This note is from the jail physician, Dr. Harvey, who's visiting on behalf of Dr. Crowdy, as you can see at the bottom there. He says, "Ephraim during this week has been steadily getting worse. None of the other prisoners complaining." There's none of the other prisoners, there's 28 other people complaining. At the bottom here in pencil, the judge has written, "What is the matter with the prisoner Taxos?" Because this individual was showing up again and again and again in these weekly reports. All right, the biggest challenge, if you could read this one. This says, "Visited prison." Are we there? Visited prison. Come along with me. Ephraim Taxos is in an advanced stage of lung disease, which has been progressing for the last year or two. He will not live much longer. Rest well. 29 prisoners. And he died 8 days after that was written. So, I looked for a death record. What I'm finding, I found death record, but what I'm finding instead in terms of his announcement in the paper, he's just tucked in under local varieties. There's no death notice in the paper properly. This documentary record, I hope you'll see, shows a really damning story about lack of resources, about colonial institutions, and about a preventable death. Because this story is about the violence of colonialism. Indigenous individuals in Canada today have significantly higher rates of tuberculosis than non-Indigenous Canadian-born folks. TB is a lingering legacy of colonialism that continues to have deleterious health effects. So, with all of that together, both of these projects, all these themes, one building mostly from skeletal remains, the other from these archival traces, I hope demonstrate to you how an anthropology of health histories can play a really critical social justice role by demonstrating the chronicity of structural issues affecting vulnerable individuals. Basically, the past is not just in the past. The past resonates with the present in really terrifying ways in some cases. So intersectionality is a theory named by Kimberly Crenshaw to frame and understand the unique experiences of Black women in the United States. And this theory explicates how multiple aspects of an individual's social identity overlap to create and preserve social inequities and discrimination. So my colleagues and I have been thinking through how intersectionality can be used meaningfully in biological anthropology to uncover and understand these complex ways in which individuals' overlapping identities affect their navigation of the world, with the aim of better understanding this embodiment of the social determinants of health. A broken bone is not just a broken bone. So with this framework, we hope we can think through the context of topics like hip fractures or social welfare access or tuberculosis exposure, to look at the value of different data sets, to think about hidden traumas, to think about institutionalized people who might be unclaimed at death even today, to ask about the context of this, thinking about the circumstances that might bring someone to an institution or a collection, the circumstances that might cause someone to be buried here and not there. Because we need to recognize and dismantle structural violence, and following the work of my colleague Karolina Delikova, also recognize and dismantle our structural apathy. Because people in the past were people, and I want to just sort of wrap up by talking about this person here. Individuals may move within and between identities and fortunes and statuses and environments and relationships in their lives. And this individual, FAO90, 1716, this is an adult of unknown sex. They were buried in the St. Bride's Lower Churchyard in London, UK, between 1770 and 1849. They might have come from the Bridewell Workhouse or the Fleet Prison. We know there are people from those institutions buried here, but we don't know this person's name. We don't know for sure. We know that this burial ground was mostly used for folks of low social status because there was no burial fee. Nobody had to pay to bury them here. Now, importantly, we need to look at this image, and this is there's not a lot of this person left. We have their dental arcade and a few other pieces. And we need to look at that and then think about folks like E.P. Thompson and meditate on class, because when we look at this person a little bit closer, we can see that they had a gold filling. So, people can move through social statuses and fortunes in their lives. We can't look at the end of somebody's life or just the one little trace of them we can find and assume that we know really anything. We need to think about what can become embodied and created to entrench and marginalize identity. And it's important to think about this as a researcher, as researchers in the audience, as consumers of this information, when we're reading popular science articles about people from the past, because there is a really uneven distribution of power, right, in the researcher and the research subject relationship. We have an immense privilege to learn from and speak about the experiences of the dead. We do not speak for the dead, and the dead cannot consent to our work. The remains could be damaged in excavation or curation. The excavation could be harmful to living descendants. The worst time in somebody's life might be the only written trace of them, and all of that should give us some pause. But do we then not tell these stories? Do we not look for these crevices and these lacunae? So as researchers, we need to keep pushing and searching for the traces of these lives that might otherwise be unknown, but to keep our positionality in mind and to think through the ethics. We have to be collaborative, interdisciplinary. Where appropriate, we want this work to occur due to community-identified goals. And for everybody here today and listening online too, we can start today. This is not meant to be depressing. We can do it. We can read the work of and cite people that are coming from outside this hegemonic global north juggernaut of scholarship. We can read the work of and cite people of color. We can read the work and reference the work of women. We can read works by and cite women of color. We can read the works of and cite junior scholars. We can read the works of and reference people from the global south, right? Look for the voices that are marginalized. Look for who's not being heard. Look for people that don't look like you, that don't come from the same background as you. Center them, center those voices. That's the message of so much of what I work on, is thinking about the resonances and thinking about what we can do about it. More than just apply, what can we do about it? Because we cannot change the fates of those that came before us, but we can identify the resonances with issues of the present and seek to make change for those that are yet to come. So thank you. I do want to really acknowledge these institutions and these funding bodies and these really specific people, here who have been such help with all of this. And if there's any questions about any of the images or any of the ethics of any of those images, I would be delighted to talk about that with you today.
So this is our question and answer period. You're going to be in demand as a speaker. There's questions about that in the chat line.
Oh, that's so nice. Is it my mom? No, I'm kidding. I know she's in there.
So a broken bone is not just a broken bone. That's our mantra tonight.
Oh, good, I'm so glad.
That's what I've learned tonight. Do we have any questions from the audience?
There were folks snapping pictures. I'm loving that. Good. Take it home and think about it more.
While you're thinking of a question, I'm going to ask you a question.
Please.
It started at the very beginning.
Yeah.
Plague doctor.
Oh, yes.
Did you become a plague doctor before COVID or after COVID?
So, really interestingly, I taught a class on the anthropology of infectious disease in fall of 2019. The last halcyon days of the before time. And I actually had the plague doctor costume in pieces. I did a lot of musical theater, big surprise for everybody who's here, and had some pieces of this costume and started to bring them to school to dress up, to talk about some of this embodiment, right, to think through who these characters were. So then when COVID hit, I thought, well, I already have these costumes. It just sort of ballooned from there. So yes, Plague Doctor Time Instagram. I'm trying to get her going again. I did the first 100 days of the lockdown every single day, much to the, maybe, I'm going to say, enjoyment of my partner, who's a medical doctor, who would come home from the pandemic in the hospital, and I would say, I've got some ideas for some pictures. I have some props. Are we going to have some fun? So he would take a shower, and then we would get to it. So yes, please go back and enjoy all of our collective trauma.
Any questions? I'm going to check the chat.
Sure. That's okay. Can I ask people that are here too? Have folks here, do you read things about bioarchaeology? Do you read all the mummy articles and things? Yes, actually, hey, how nice to see you. Hi. Tell me all about the things you read.
I pretty much read anything that comes onto my feed about bioarchaeology. So
Yeah.
a lot of the stuff that I've heard about are bog bodies and stuff from Siberia and stuff.
Yeah.
And a lot of, I've been trying to really look into Persian archaeology because I'm Persian.
Yeah.
We really don't have much documentation on that, and we don't really have much on the medical anthropology side of that. So I'm trying to look into West Asian sources.
Thank you. Continue to do so. Just in case people maybe couldn't hear from there, just the idea of things coming across the feed and interest in lots of things all over the world. And I think that's one thing, we didn't really talk about it here, but what I'm sort of shouting at you about, we can do it now! Part of that is the ethical consumption of information about other people's bodies and thinking about that too, because thinking about things like autonomy and consent, it can feel really overwhelming to think about how am I consuming this and what am I going to do with it afterwards. So it sounds like you're trying to do this in an ethical manner of looking at it, thinking it through, and thinking about where we need more. I think that's really, really exciting. Oh, so thanks for coming. Sorry, somebody did put their hand up and I shouted over you. Yes?
Yeah, I was just curious, speaking of someone who works in a hospital with clinical trial stuff,
Yeah.
how do you navigate getting ethics approval to work with these things? Because I know even just for research and studies and all the ethics board would do so much, which is about doing things a certain way.
Yeah, okay, so the question is, we've got a lovely person here who works in the hospital who witnesses clinical trials happening and is going, how could you possibly be doing anything you're doing? What's the research ethics board kind of application process? Is that okay? So what's really, really interesting is that for the most part, to work with human skeletal remains, there generally is no research ethics board process that is standard. So some institutions, for instance, if I'm applying to work at an institution where there's a curated collection, I might need to apply to work with them. If I wanted to do destructive testing, like grinding down a tooth to look for plague or something like that, I would need permission. Some folks do run it through their institutional research ethics board, but for the most part, that is for living people or for living people's recently taken tissues. This is not controversial. So I've been talking actually a lot with my students about this. Should we be running absolutely everything through whether or not it's required? So the work I talked to you about today, I made proposals, I won grants for, and so lots of people knew I was doing it, but I never ran it through a research ethics board. So I've been thinking about this a lot recently, and the entire field has been thinking about this a lot recently. I'm not a maverick. This is sort of how things have been working, but there have been a lot of questions over, do we need to be, and I think not even asking the question, do we need to be, but we should be putting ethical statements and positionality statements into our work to talk about who am I to have access to this? How did I get that access? So within the actual remains or skeletons, there tends to be permissions from the curating institutions. With the archival work, a lot of the medical records that have been made available, I was working with medical records, and still am, that are held at the rooms, the provincial archives in Newfoundland and Labrador. And so I needed to apply for sort of just a research agreement, essentially, with the provincial archivist. And so I was given permission to take photographs and work with those, as long as I acknowledge, who was it that gave me the permission to work with them. So it is a little different in terms of ethics. I always sort of joke with my students, like, and then we invented ethics, and we stopped doing X and Y, because so much, of course, of the history of biomedicine is built on the backs of enslaved people and folks who did not consent to medical experimentation, et cetera. We don't do that anymore, obviously, so how did we get to that point? So the work with living people that I do, the interview work, requires enormous research ethics board engagement, and so working with a lot of living people and talking to them about their lived experiences has made me do even more reflection on the ethical work, and I'm currently writing a paper about it, classic academic, writing a paper about this right now. It's all about the ethics of working with medical records historically. The historians have been doing a lot of this work already, but the anthropologists came to the medical records a little later, and we're thinking about them slightly differently. So I guess watch this space or get in touch, because I'd love to chat with you more about how you're navigating even watching that happen. I think it's super fascinating. So thank you for bringing that question.
There's a question right back here.
Oh, hi, yes.
Hi. What about the deaths of people in sanatoriums with regards to the hip fracture? Because I know apparently healthy people today die a year after they receive a hip fracture.
Yeah.
And they're apparently healthy, right?
Right.
So what makes the people in the sanatoriums unique in that sense?
That's a great question. So asking about the hip fracture work in terms of, is there uniqueness to the people that are dying of the hip fractures versus in clinical work today, most people don't die of the hip fracture immediately, but there can be sort of sequelae that come along. So that's such a really, it's a complex question. I'll try to answer it. I hope that I can kind of get to it. So everybody is special and everybody's unique, right? So nobody's unique in a certain way. And so with the people we were working with, most of these folks were ending up in institutions because they had nowhere else to go, right? And so they were living in long-term care homes or had been taken into a psychiatric institution and then suffered a hip fracture while there. So most folks were not there for a hip fracture. They were suffering this injury while they were in the institution. So our question was this inevitable? And so we looked at the different age cohorts. We said, okay, well, we can expect more in older folks because we know osteopenia, osteoporosis, maybe some dizziness and issues with that sort of thing, so it would make sense. And so yes, older folks definitely were suffering hip fractures. We were finding folks in every age cohort were lining up that if they were institutionalized, they were more likely to have this injury. So we thought there's something there. It's not just being older. And that's really important because it just adds this intersectional layer of maybe there's an age, maybe your social race, your social class means you ended up in this place. But to be institutionalized was a major factor in this happening to them. So that was kind of our interest for us. We were, in most cases too, there's other people that had hip fractures where they had healed. So they were in the process of healing. So we thought, okay, this might have happened before the person's institutionalized, et cetera. But just noticing also the lack of surgical intervention for anybody that was from the institution felt really distressing, honestly. And this work was very emotional to kind of, when you're reading about it, we're pretty sure, and then to actually go and look at the person's body and see really kind of the evidence of that lack of care. So a modern hip fracture, you're far less likely to end up in this way, but it is still a huge risk. We see lots of folks that suffer a hip fracture and end up dying of pneumonia, right, and all these other issues. And a lot of it just is a huge shock to the system. It's a major injury and should not be thought of as something to take lightly for sure. Thank you for your question.
I have a couple of online
Oh,
questions,
great.
and then we'll get to you. The first question is, as mentioned, archival documents are often produced by institutions as
Yes.
documents of surveillance.
Yes.
Considering this, is it possible to assert the individual agency of the deceased? And I am thinking of the structure-agency tension in anthropological theory.
Oh my gosh, thank you for that question so much. So I hope that was loud enough for everybody, but maybe folks at home are seeing that as well. So, yes, this is such a good question, and this is what I mentioned super briefly with the sort of a lot of archival documents can be seen through these violent colonial perspectives. This is not reading against the archival grain. Absolutely. If we're looking at institutional records, we need to know who's producing them, and it tends to be within the context I've been looking at, folks in power, in the hierarchy of power. So these are documents that are imbued with power, are imbued with violence in that way. So when I talk about this with my classes, of course we're reading Goffman, right? We're talking about, the roles people are playing. We're talking about the acting that is brought on. If you are being surveilled, are you ever actually being yourself? Is there autonomy in an institution? So it's really important to talk through all those issues as well. So I think the answer is maybe. I don't mean to sort of throw it aside, but maybe, and this is what I've been grappling with working with the hospital records, is that when we look at, for instance, the Newfoundland records, folks coming into the general hospital who are coming in with, a breast cancer, let's say, or with an injury. And if I can, in some cases, I can find those injuries described in the newspapers, because journalistic ethics also was not invented yet. So we have all this personal information about people in the newspapers. So I worry about the lack of autonomy, and I've talked about this with some of my colleagues in terms of autonomy being that you have the ability to make decisions for yourself, right, with this bioethics. And so I think there's a tension there where we are, while we're trying not to speak for people, there is still an intrusion upon their autonomy. And I think that that's maybe impossible to avoid. And so we need to think really carefully about whose names we are publishing or whose bodies we are looking at. And that's why there has been a major call for a pause in biological and anthropological work with these collections. This data I was showing you from the Smithsonian was collected many years ago now. And there's been a pause on these collections, and so no further research is currently being done with them, no further data being collected to allow the field to think through some of these issues, as these folks never consented to being in this research. And of course, nobody thought that I would be old nosy me poking through their medical records 150 years later. And the other part of this, and maybe this is beyond what you want me to talk about, I'm doing some work currently with some 18th century hospital records, and then some looking at 1918 flu from the beginning of the 20th century. And there's a wonderful blog post written by this great historian who talks about the dead and the very dead. And this idea of, is the temporal distance, does that mean that we can then talk about people more freely? And is that just about our own comfort level? So I hope I've rambled in some way that made sense for that question, but I think it's so important. I think that the way we talk about these things and the theory that we couch it in allows us to move forward as ethically as possible, but just knowing that there are ethical quandaries everywhere with this work. And so the question always becomes, do we then not do it and not allow these stories to be amplified or not? And are we the right people to be doing it? And that's something I've been thinking about a lot. So thank you for bringing that forward.
I have one more virtual question, and then we'll get to you. Can you tell us how you bring community engagement into this work? For example, you talked about descendant people from communities who might have a stake or interest in this type of work.
That's a great question. So for the work with people who are, I don't want to say anonymous, they had names, we just don't know what their names are. With the work with sort of 18th and 19th century folks I've been working on in London, England, for the most part, these are not named individuals, so there is really no way for us to trace a specific person who might be involved with them. But a project I'm working on right now that I'd be really excited to talk about briefly that we are working for this community engagement is working with the archival records surrounding the Dynevor Indian Hospital. And I use that term because that was the term of this hospital in the 1930s and 40s, the very first segregated tuberculosis hospital for Indigenous people in Canada. And there are some records from this hospital with names and with communities and reserves and residential schools actually recorded. And so what we were doing is trying to get in touch with as many people as possible who were affected and get these records to them and ask them, do you want us to work on this, or do you want us to just give this to you because we've been able to access it? So that's an example where working with communities to ask them, what do you want to do with this? Some folks have been super pumped, other folks have not been that excited about it. Where the idea is just to actually do something with these records and ask questions about these bodies and experiences and colonialism in a way that is helpful and not harmful. Because, of course, there can be no reconciliation without truth, and people having access to their own medical records is a major step forward in that truth. So that's an example where we're actively really doing that. With some of the examples here, there is work currently at institutions like the Cleveland Museum of Natural History, which holds another one of these enormous biological and anthropological collections, to start to do some of that work, actually looking for descendants of some of the folks in the collection. So this is one of those, watch this space and watch it carefully and hold us accountable, because this work is starting, and I think it's going to be a long, painful process, but a deeply necessary one. So I hope in the future, everything can be driven by community-identified priorities, for sure.
I was wondering, something I've been seeing a lot in like the Indigenous scholarship work that I've been seeing is like a lot of illness that we're seeing, including specifically hip fractures, is worsened by loneliness. And I've been seeing that a lot in scholarship post-COVID especially. And I've been wondering, in situations like a sanatorium, or even in modern day, like that situation in Oakville with that poor elderly lady there, like a lot of these people like, if you're surrounded by people, you're still probably not getting that same kind of social stimulus
Yeah.
or that sense of family and, like, belonging that you would have
Yeah.
normally. And I wonder, have you come across anything like that in your research with hip fractures, or do you have any insight or anything about the research there?
Yeah, so not with hip fractures specifically, but with some of the other Newfoundland work where I'm looking at early 20th century, where there are people that are sort of showing up in various different collections. So I'm trying to look at everything broadly, and some names will come up, and I can think of an example where a woman, her husband and she had ended up in the poorhouse, and they were then moved to, pardon me for this, the insane asylum, as it was called, the lunatic asylum at the time, and he passed away. And so there was a question, though, was whether or not she actually was mentally ill or whether or not she was there because she had nowhere else to be. So she was taken to the hospital. She had a breast cancer surgery that was successful. And then there's this pause, and they just took her back to the mental institution because she had nowhere else to be. And she writes a letter to the government and says, I do not think that I am insane. You know, and it honestly makes me upset even to think of her words, but she says, you know, thank you for the books that you brought me on your visit. I do not think that I am insane. I think that I am here because there's nowhere else for me to be, so perhaps it's the best place for me to be. And then they move her back to the poorhouse, and she passes away not long after that. So I don't know that's a story specifically of loneliness, but there's an isolation that's really clear and questions of illness and wellness, like we talked about in anthropology of health, like wellness and illness, and how does that play out socially? And what does it mean to be insane at that time? And I think studies of madness are really picking up on a lot of these threads, and I think we owe it to those scholars to kind of bring some of that in as well. So I haven't found anybody specifically talking about their hip fracture in that way. We have, unfortunately, mostly just the end of their life, right? So having some of these clues where people do write about themselves, you know, these rare moments where we can find them, are so emotional and so powerful because, again, we're never giving them their humanity back, right? It's just finding those glimpses of that humanity and that lived life and what that could mean. So I think about her a lot, and again, classic academic, I'm like, I want to write about her, but I want to write about her in a way that talks about the autonomy or the lack of autonomy she may have experienced because she is being shuttled to these places, but she is an individual who can write about herself. I think there's a lot there. So yeah, she haunts me, and I really want to talk about her more. So thank you for allowing me to talk about her a little bit today. Her name was Mary.
We have time for one last question. Anybody? For tonight. Thank you so much, Professor Mann.
Thank you. Thank you for the question.